Hello, class. Today we're going to be talking about Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler is also one of the Neo-Freudians, but he deserves a whole chapter unto himself in your text, and I think the latest edition of your text does have indeed a whole chapter on Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler, as I said, was a disciple of Sigmund Freud's. Like so many other disciples of Freud, he was very close to Sigmund Freud, but eventually had a falling out over a couple of issues about which both were not willing to budge. And I wanted to mention that several counseling texts do mention something about Alfred Adler. Adler is a very important figure in the history of counseling, but he's largely overlooked these days in a lot of modern training programs. I include him for very selfish reasons. He is my favorite therapist of all time. Certainly no therapist has influenced me more than Alfred Adler, and I hope that by introducing you a bit to his theory, you can gain an appreciation for why I like him so much. He was very much someone who was ahead of his time, and he was also someone who seemed to walk on the margins between two or three different theoretical orientations and sought to integrate them. And I felt like he did a very good job of trying to integrate those two theoretical orientations. The two main ones he tried to integrate were psychoanalysis and then what would later become cognitive behavior therapy. Alfred Adler was not technically a cognitive behavior therapist. He never used that term, but he should be recognized as the grandfather of cognitive behavior therapy, and I think you'll understand why when we talk about him in due course. Here's some pictures of Adler. The one on the lower right is him giving an invited lecture in the United States, and then a photo ID for identification. And his several times, I think he came to the United States to give lectures, and again, very influential. A man who was very famous in his time, but as time wore on, the two people that we remember most from this era are Sigmund Freud, of course, and then his main disciple, Carl Jung. But I actually put Alfred Adler right there at the very top of my favorite therapists of all time. Here's a flyer announcing a series of lectures given by Alfred Adler at the Williams Institute in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. And that shows you how much it costs to be an attendee to this series of lectures. You could go to the whole program for $25. It would last about 11 days. These are his dates, 1870 through 1937. He was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. If you are curious, the main reason why Alfred Adler had a parting of ways with Sigmund Freud was because of the emphasis that Freud had placed on sexual tension, primarily in the form of repressed id impulses as the source of pathology. Adler believed that social influences were more powerful than sexual or instinctual impulses. And one bit of evidence to back up Alfred Adler is that we have since learned in a series of many studies that have looked at the social phenomenon of rejection, particularly peer rejection. They have found that to be, of all the unpleasant experiences that a human being can endure, the feeling of rejection ranks at the very top of the most unpleasant. Now, if you ask people what their biggest fears in life are, they'll usually say something like death and public speaking, or something like this, or they might list a phobia if they do indeed have a condition where they have a phobic fear. But if you are looking at how a person responds behaviorally and emotionally, nothing hurts more than the sting of rejection. And Adler was very much ahead of his time in recognizing rejection and feelings of inferiority and feeling like you've been left out, feeling like society has cast you aside as being an enormous determinant in a person's life. So Adler, from the very get-go in a young person's life, figured out that a child can figure out quite quickly if they're on the inside or on the outside. And whether they're on the inside or the outside matters a great deal to how they perceive themselves. And then what they do in response to their rejected or outsider status determines a great deal in their lives. Adler believed that social influences were more important in determining pathology Freud believed that it was personality dynamics, specifically in the form of repressed id impulses or sexual impulses that were the source of most cases of psychopathology. Adler believed that the personality was not governed by three distinct forces, but that personality was much more integrated than this and much more unified than having been comprised of three separate parts. Adler is looked upon by people who study history as being a very respectable individual and someone who's actually quite inspiring because he didn't come from a particularly notable background. His family wasn't very strongly educated. He himself had endured a lot of rejection as a child. He was quite sickly and ill as a child. He was quite clumsy, not very coordinated, was not very popular. And so he was one of those people that you never really pegged early on as being someone who was going to amount to something particularly noteworthy or much less great. His approach to psychology was called individual psychology. And individual psychology, like Carl Jung in some respects, Alfred Adler did emphasize the role of conscious forces over unconscious drives as having an influence on a person's life. Now, remember, Carl Jung, more than anybody, placed an emphasis on the unconscious, particularly the collective unconscious, as being a vastly important, deep, deep well of wisdom and strength and identity. But Alfred Adler believed that we are primarily motivated by things that we are aware of and that this influences how we behave. He argued that people, generally speaking, are purposeful and goal-oriented. This already you can begin to see a little bit of his cognitive behavioral leanings because the cognitive behavioral approach puts a large emphasis on how we perceive things and that how we feel is largely shaped by how we think and how we behave. So our behaviors and our thoughts often dictate our mood states. So you can see already here the beginnings of a mind that was very much interested in how the mind worked and how the mind shaped our reality. He believed that the primary force in life was our response to early feelings of inferiority. Now, when we say the word inferior, we're usually talking about a person who is of maybe a lesser class or a lower class, or someone who's low quality, or someone who isn't quite as smart as the rest of the crowd. We might say that person is inferior. If you ever studied racism before, you may have heard people, some racists believe that there are some races that are superior races and some that are inferior. Adolf Hitler comes to mind when talking about that. But for Adler, his definition of inferiority was a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily that you were less than. It was kind of a belief that you were less than. It was much more personal. They were, if you had feelings of weakness or passivity or fragility or vulnerability or failure about yourself, those feelings that you had about yourself could amount to a self-concept that was quite inferior. It wasn't so much that you were inferior, it's that you believed you were inferior. You believed that you were less than others, and you believed that you didn't fit in. You believed that you were an outcast or a reject. And those beliefs were so instrumental in how you would go on living your life. So that's the primary force of psychopathology. And our motivation to overcome our feelings of inferiority, which he believes that we all have. He said every single person has some feeling of inferiority about themselves, and that most people try to strive to overcome those feelings of inferiority. And it is our striving to overcome inferiority that he called superiority striving. Superiority striving is a very Adlerian term. It's associated with our attempts to make ourselves be better people. If we feel like we're weak athletically, then we'll train athletically. If we feel like we're not very smart, we'll read more books and try to become more educated. If we're not very popular, we'll try to imitate people who are popular. If we aren't getting attention of someone that we have a crush on, we may go out of our way to try to make ourselves more interesting or presentable. And these are all examples of how we might strive for superiority. So how we strive for superiority, that is, how we try to overcome feelings of weakness, is a big part of our lives. So, how we strive for superiority, he called your lifestyle or style of life, to be more specific. And he said everyone has a style of life. What do you mean by a style of life? Well, a style of life is just very simply how each person tries to overcome their feelings of inferiority, to have some sense of mastery and success and control in their lives to make them feel better about themselves. And he said, your style of life can be unhealthy or healthy. A healthy style of life is when, while you're trying to improve yourself, you remain an unselfish person with pro-social goals. That is, as you are trying to improve yourself, you're also trying to improve the world around you. So think of a person who's trying to study very hard, and while that person is studying very hard, he also helps out other people at school who are trying to study but may not be as far along in school as he is. So he starts a study group that both benefits himself but benefits other people as well. That would be an example of a pro-social, unselfish style of life, and he would call that very healthy. Meanwhile, an unhealthy, or what he often called a mistaken style of life, is when someone tries to overcome their feelings of inferiority by being very self-centered and zeroing in on extremely selfish goals as a way to live. And so it largely, a person who has an unhealthy style of life is a person who doesn't really care about the rest of the world. They just want to make sure that they are never put in a position of inferiority ever again. They feel like they're very weak, and so they want to, instead of trying to lift other people up and make all people strong, they're only out for themselves, and they try to make themselves only be the strong person. And then on top of that, they try to dominate other people with their superiority striving. So you can see already that the difference between a healthy style of life and an unhealthy style of life is the extent to which your goals in life contribute to society. He called this social interest, the degree to which your style of life demonstrates social interest, your care and concern about the rest of the world as you yourself are trying to become a better human being. That was the difference between a healthy person and an unhealthy person. Adler talked about a strong sense of community feeling, that healthy people have one characteristic that really distinguishes themselves from other people. Healthy people are very much bound to their communities. They feel close to their communities. They feel like they invest in their communities. They feel like they're protected by their communities. Their communities have not let them down. And so people are very much tied to the society around them, to the world around them. Again, this is a much stronger statement than Freud made about how we relate to others. Freud was very much a person who looked inside the mind and heart of the individual, whereas Adler is much more interested in how people related to the world around them, especially the social world. So he argued that the more pro-social and more pro-community you were, the less stressful and less inferior we will feel. So this is not just something that benefits the world around us. When we invest in the community, we end up improving our lives as well. Plus, when we get into trouble, you're much more likely to get help from that community you've invested in than if you were basically living an isolative lifestyle. So Adler put an enormous influence on the power and importance of relationships in therapy and outside of therapy. I'm reminded of a therapist who once told me, unless I have a relationship with my client, I feel like I'm not going to help my client get better. Adler was very much that way. He wanted to have a relationship, not a personal relationship outside of therapy, but while the client was in the therapeutic chair, as it were, Adler wanted to make sure that he was behaving in a genuine and authentic way and tried to relate to this person as a human being. In that way, he was very much like Carl Rogers in person-centered therapy that came decades later. So relationships are a big part of Adler's theory. Adler, like Freud, we mentioned that he was a psychoanalyst. Alfred Adler believed that early experiences were very important. One thing, though, that he talked about more than Freud was the importance of birth order. Alfred Adler is the name in birth order. By birth order, we mean if you are coming from a family of 5 children, what child are you? Are you the oldest, second oldest? Are you the middle child? Or the youngest? What's most important about birth order, according to Adler, is not actually where you were born, but your perception of what it means that you were born in that particular way. So, for example, There could be one family where someone is the oldest child, and that might not mean very much at all because all the kids were basically raised the same thing. But you might go to another family where being the firstborn child carries with it all sorts of expectations and all sorts of consequences for incorrect behavior. So what Adler would ask is not just what number were you in the family. He would ask, what does it mean to be, say, for example, the middle child? What does it mean for you and your family to be the youngest child? What does it mean in your family for you to be the oldest child? It's the perception of what's true that's far more important than the actual number that you were. Adler gave lots of advice to parents about how they would raise their children. He advised against spoiling and neglecting children. And then I put right here that this is just like fixation, because it is. Remember, Sigmund Freud said that a parent should never give too much attention or too little attention to children at any particular age, or they'll become fixated at that particular stage, either because of neglect or because they've been given no incentive to grow. And so Adler very much agreed with that. He said that fixation will impair a child's style of life. Here's something that I think we can all relate to. Adler was a big fan of this idea that what you're born with is not nearly as important as what you do with it. It's not whether or not you have an actual set of skills. It's what you do with the skills you've been given. So your response to a crisis, your response to a challenge, your response to rejection says far more about who you are than how much you're actually able to accomplish. So for Adler, perceptions are also very important. The 3 tasks for Adler that every person needs to address in life is to build friendships, he calls this the social task, to establish intimacy, which is the love/marriage task, and to contribute to society, which is the occupational task. If you look at each of these 3, basically friends, lovers, and work, these are really big areas in any person's life. And according to Adler, not completing any of these steps may cause some dysfunction or pathology. That doesn't mean that every single person needs to be married. If you're looking at number 2 and wondering if that applies to every single person, what he's really talking about here is, do you have the ability to form an intimate relationship with someone? So it doesn't necessarily mean marriage. It just means, do you have the ability to get close to someone, to trust that person, and to have that person trust in you? Here's a nice Adlerian term, fictional finalism. Fictional finalism. Alfred Adler believed that pathology also stems from the exaggerated expectation that we should be perfect. I think we all know people who have perfectionistic tendencies. We ourselves may, from time to time, suffer from perfectionism, the belief that everything needs to be just right or it's not worth doing at all. Adler's term for this was not perfectionism. He called it fictional finalism. Fictional meaning it's not true. It doesn't actually mean what you think it means. And finalism as if to say it's the ultimate thing in your mind even though you're wrong. So fictional finalism is just a way of saying lots of people who are unhealthy have the belief that things must be a certain way. And if they're not a certain way, then things are a disaster. Life is a disaster. And of course, Adler disagreed with this adamantly. Fictional finalism is more normal in children. Lots of children kind of exhibit symptoms of fictional finalism, like, if I can't have this toy, I don't want any toy at all. Or if I can't be happy at my birthday party, no one can be happy and everybody must be miserable. Or if I don't get so-and-so, then no one can get anything. So it's not just that I need to be happy, it's that everyone else needs to be sadder than me. So this is more normal in children, but in the adult population, if an adult acts this way, in other words, like a childish person or like a bratty adolescent, this can be absolutely destructive to a person's relationships. The therapeutic process for Alfred Adler was to try to improve life functioning. Now, isn't that interesting? That's a little different than what Freud would say. Freud would say that we need to learn to live in balance and harmony with the different parts of our personality, that we need to feel the freedom to live and love and work without any kind of guilt. And he basically viewed therapy as a way to reconstruct the personality. Notice Adler here is not getting so deep. He's basically just trying to get you to improve your overall level of functioning in life. If you're someone who wants to be working, then let's get you back to work as soon as possible. If you're someone who wants to be reliable and admired in relationships, how do we get you to the place where you become more admired and more likable and more reliable? He also wanted people to feel more cooperative with other people, to look to society for some answers to life's questions, to contribute to society, and to build trusting relationships with people in the world, to be courageous, and to be satisfied. The author of your text, Gerald Corey, said that there are 4 objectives involved in doing Adlerian therapy that aren't necessarily done in perfect logical order, but that nevertheless are really important objectives. Number 1, to establish a proper therapeutic relationship. Number 2, to explore the psychological dynamics within a patient, and you do this by an assessment. 3, to encourage the development of self-understanding, which is what we've already identified as insight, and to help a patient make new choices, which is going to involve them taking some risks, doing things a little bit different, being slightly unsettled as you take those risks, and this is a process of reorientation and re-education. Rudolf Dreikurs, who was mentioned on the previous slide, was someone who was a follower of Alfred Adler and did an enormous amount of work translating his work into English and popularizing it in other countries, particularly in the United States. Rudolf Dreikurs is the epitome of a disciple of Alfred Adler, so we need to talk about him a little bit too. Dreikurs and Adler both believed that no person is the same and nobody can fit into the same box. So you can't just do the same kind of therapy for everybody. You need to tweak it and tailor it to this particular patient's needs. So a lot of time goes into how to be the right kind of therapist and how to have the right kind of approach given where every patient was a little bit different. So nobody can fit into that same box. No treatment, for that matter, looks exactly the same. Even if you have a whole theoretical orientation and a series of techniques and what to do, your therapeutic process with one person is not going to match the therapeutic process with another person. That's an important thing to remember. Just in the same way that no parent can raise all of their children by running them through a uniform child-rearing mill. Everything requires a little bit of balancing to get things just right. A successful therapist should always take a person's total context into account. You must enter radically into their subjective and phenomenological world. This sounds very much like the work of Carl Jung. The first task in therapy is to encourage patients that they are not sick or crazy, but simply discouraged in their attempts to belong and to compensate. So one of the first things you say is to the patient, according to Adler, is you're doing fine. What you're going through is perfectly understandable. You're just feeling a little down right now because what you're trying to do just isn't working. You're trying to belong. You're trying to compensate for whatever problems you have. You're trying to improve, but you're not getting very far, and that feels very discouraging. That's how a good therapist responds. The second task is to encourage patients to analyze their respective styles of life, evaluate the consequences, and adjust them to be more adaptive. So Adler would do what he called a lifestyle investigation. So when you did therapy with Adler, he didn't just talk about these things. He actually had a formal intervention called a lifestyle investigation, where you address the following areas. Your family constellation, which basically has to do with how the family relates to each other. A constellation is a pattern of stars in the sky that take a distinct shape. And just like in the sky, in astronomy, families also are defined somewhat by the constellations that they comprise. So the way that the father relates to the mother, the way the mother relates to the daughter, the way the daughter relates to the brother, and so on and so forth, shows us the constellation of a particular family. By studying the family constellation, what you're really driving at is who were the primary familial influences you had while growing up? Was it a parent? Was it a grandparent, perhaps? In many cultures around the world, the grandparent plays a more pivotal role even than the parent. It's very interesting. Part of the lifestyle investigation also looked at brief recollections, which basically says what seemingly minor instances were actually major developmental moments. Adler believed that when you ask this question, you often generate really interesting answers. What small thing that the world seemed to think was pretty inconsequential and not very much a big deal for you in that moment represented something very powerful and very formative in your life? Can you think of anything? This was all part of that lifestyle investigation. He would explore those fictional finalism goals or the fictional hidden goals. He would ask it in this way, however: what impossible expectation of perfection or perfectionism have you been striving for? That's a great question to ask yourself every once in a while. Ask yourself something like, Jay, what impossible expectation of perfectionism have I or have you been striving for? And do your best to try to answer honestly and to come to terms with yourself. Another part of the lifestyle investigation is to follow up on basic mistakes, which is really just another way of asking the question, what distorted beliefs do you hold? This is very similar to the man who was probably more influenced by Alfred Adler than any other therapist, the world-famous cognitive psychologist Albert Ellis. We'll talk about him later in the course. It's Albert Ellis that comprised a list or composed a list of the most irrational beliefs that most people believe to some extent, but never assumed to be false because they, again, that's all that they've had. Albert Ellis made a list of completely irrational, unhelpful beliefs that actually sound pretty plausible and sound like lots of people would agree with them, but that actually are quite damaging and destructive. After objective and subjective interviews have been conducted, then what was called the question, open quote, close quote, is asked in therapy with Alfred Adler. How would your life be different, and what would you do differently if you didn't have this particular symptom or problem? Another way of asking it is to ask the miracle question. The miracle question goes something like this. Let's suppose that you went to bed tonight, and just before going to bed, a miracle happened. All of the problems that you've ever had in your life suddenly melted away, and they were no longer problems, but you were still alive. You woke up the next morning, and the whole day to you was new, because everything that was getting in the way, everything that was posing a challenge or a problem to you has now been taken care of. What would you do with your day? How would your life be different if all of your problems disappeared? And what Adler found is that how a person would answer this question would say as much about the problem than anything else. It would lead people to conclude, is this an organic issue that we need to talk about? Or is this another issue that might be more psychological, such as a person who's avoiding what needs to take place? So this approach, this lifestyle investigation, is very collaborative. It goes back and forth, lots of testing, new ideas, lots of bringing ideas to the fore. And the doctor and the patient in this relationship were often seen primarily as being equals. The stages of therapy contain 12 stages, in which almost all of the issues are discussed already. Now, we're not going to talk about every stage here, but just know that there are 12 distinct stages that Adler discussed. But remember, even though he had all of these stages is not the heart of Alfred Adler's therapy. He was very much a people person. He would tailor therapy to the patient rather than trying to make the patient fit his particular therapeutic style. Modern Adlerian therapists adopt the 4-stage model of Draker's called Adlerian brief therapy, which is ABT, which you see right there, midway to the final section of the chapter on Alfred Adler. In an older edition of the text, it was page 104 and following. The strengths of the Adlerian approach include that it's very encouraging. Courage, remember, is not the absence of fear, but acting in the presence of fear. Or I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's famous quote about courage. He said, "Courage is rightly esteemed to be the greatest of all human virtues, because it's the one virtue that assures all the other ones." Encouragement builds confidence. It doesn't remove fear, but it does put fear into perspective. Our fears, some of them are very irrational, but some of them are very well reasoned and well grounded. If someone is speaking up and saying that this is something that we need to identify but nevertheless move forward in, we should pay attention. Changing the way we think helps us discover new possibilities of living. We become unstuck from our old ways of perceiving things. According to Adler, that's what causes so many people to be stuck, is they just can't stop thinking about something in a different way. They keep on going back to thinking about it the same old way that wasn't working. Adlerian therapy is very flexible. It can be used in a variety of settings, including school, parent education, marital therapy, and even family and group therapy. Other strength, it was the first therapy to generate questions about racial, gender, and social inequities and the quality of the attempts to overcome certain imbalances in cognitive treatment. It's very holistic, comprehensive, and contextual. Also very strengths-based. This is preferred because it is more cognitively correct. We aren't usually as bad as we think we are. Adler himself was a strong advocate for the equality of all persons and didn't believe that there should be any kind of class system in terms of human superiority or inferiority. He tried to focus on patients as being discouraged rather than sick, and for a lot of people this felt very liberating and very freeing. He wouldn't say that a person had a particular diagnosis unless it was absolutely necessary. For the most part, he just said, I can see you're frustrated. I can see that this has been a source of great pain for you. I can see that you're discouraged. And this brought a lot of people hope, and it made them feel that their problems were normal. The techniques themselves are very flexible. You can apply different interventions at different times to keep that flexibility alive. You can also be an Adlerian therapist and practice from a variety of different theoretical perspectives, because Adlerian therapy itself is so open-minded to other techniques and other approaches. You'll find that it gives people plenty of opportunity to make it their own. Typically, Adlerian therapy is shorter than psychoanalysis, as many of the techniques are designed to align oneself to the tracks or to jumpstart one's life. So while there is some degree of kind of an expectation that therapy is going to go a certain length of time, Adler's assumption is that we might be able to do it a little bit more quickly if we turn the corner really quickly and hit it off very quickly shortly after therapy begins. So the last two slides here I'm going to skip because they are involving group exercises. Again, I might have you, as I have before, have you do a forum that's based on a group exercise. But right now, that's where we're going to quit with Alfred Adler, and I'd like for you to review those major terms. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll be glad to answer them. 626-825-6200.